This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and today is Thursday, May 25th. Yesterday, I was out visiting the zoo with my kids, and I saw the notification come across the news that Tina Turner had died, and having grown up through the 80s, I remember seeing and hearing Tina Turner. I never really liked her very much, wasn't into that kind of music, but saw that she died, and there just happened to be a quote shared, something that she had spoken, and she said, when talking about her age, because she was very active for an older woman, she said, 70 is the new 50. And she was sort of bragging about how modern healthcare has given us the opportunity to enjoy life for longer and to live at an older age as if we were younger, and that what we can do today is very different from past generations. And that kind of talk is common today, even though when you really search it out, you find it's not true at all. We can extend the human lifespan, but we're doing so by all sorts of artificial means, and they're not necessarily increasing or improving the quality of life. I would agree, though, with what she said. I think it is true that 50 is the new 30, 70 is the new 50, and so on. But I think that there's a bad reason why that's the case. I think it's because people living today are more immature than people were in past generations. I can see this among my old friends, my relatives, and I can even see it in my own children. I can see that with each generation it seems like men and women get more immature in their behavior. And I don't necessarily think that it's their fault. I think there's a lot that's going on in the modern world that's causing this, but it's a bad thing. And I think this also relates to the challenges that we face in parenting and homeschooling in particular. I recently saw an article where a college professor was, as they all tend to do, complaining about the inabilities and weaknesses of the students who are coming into college, and saying similar words to those that were spoken by Tina Turner, but with a very different intention. He said, 12th graders today are like 8th graders 20 years ago. And so again, it's clear that the idea that life is better today and older people are doing better things than they did before is really not true. The reality is that people are simply living more immaturely than they did in the past, and this is evident in education, in business, in society in general, and so on. And like I said, it has an effect on our parenting that I think we have to take seriously and really work to get into our brains that the challenges we face as parents and teachers are not what we likely thought they were when we first fantasized about being parents. We thought about having children. We thought about what our family would be like, what our relationships would be like. We're going to find that it's not going to be so. We're going to find that things happen on a time scale that we didn't anticipate, and it's much more difficult than we had anticipated. It requires much more virtue than we had anticipated. It's going to require a lot more time, a lot more energy, a lot more patience, a lot more prudence, a lot more courage than we likely anticipated when we first thought about how fun it would be when we had our own kitchen and our own nursery and could buy our own baby clothes and all these sorts of things. Parenting in the 21st century is not what it used to be. And I'd like to talk about some of the reasons why and how we can deal with them, because this kind of stuff is important for us to understand. The first and most serious problem that we face in modern society is caused by democracy. Democracy was an idea that was concocted by men who were not saints, not doctors of the church, but secular men, some Protestants, some of different religious persuasions, but certainly not Catholics. And we've got to realize that we live in a society as Catholics that was not designed by Catholics or for Catholics. Now, this society has existed and developed for 200 years now, and we're only beginning to see the consequences of this idea of democracy. And it seems like it gets uglier and uglier with each generation. And there's a reason for that. In the Ethics, Aristotle talks about the relationship between a family and the state. And the state has a duty to perform in order to promote the happiness of all of its members. The state is responsible to establish laws and enforce those laws which are in the best interests of all the people in the state. The family, I should say the parents are the first level of human government. So when a child is born into the world, that child is born into a little political unit of its own, and that's the family. And the parents have authority over the child. They make the rules in the house, they teach the rules to the children, and they have the authority to reward and punish the children according to those rules. The 10 Commandments teaches children, honor thy father and thy mother. So the first circle of government in the life of an individual is the government of his or her parents. And so obedience to parents is the foundation of human society, of political science. It's assumed that parents are responsible for the training and teaching and discipline of their children. And much of society doesn't work when parents fail to do this. For example, a 10-year-old boy could be out loose in the streets causing trouble. He can be puncturing car tires, breaking windows. He can even kill people. Just because he's 10 years old doesn't mean he doesn't have the ability to be extremely destructive and hurtful. It's assumed in our society that his parents will prevent him from doing that. And when we look at the laws really don't apply to a 10-year-old boy, because the laws are assuming that children are going to be dealt with by their parents. And when parents don't do their job of managing and training and disciplining their own children, their minor children, children under the age of 18, can have all kinds of negative effects in society. And the state really isn't designed to deal with them. And so what the state tends to do when parents are found to be completely neglecting their responsibilities is simply take the children away from those parents and give them to other adults to take care of and raise. So the first circle of government is that of the parents. Now, as the children get older, it becomes impossible for parents to maintain control over the children. Just think about what happens. You have a mother and a father who are responsible to work. They have got stuff to do. They're responsible to work. They're managing the education of these children. But if these children are well raised and well cared for, and I can say this of my own children, they grow up and they quickly become stronger than their parents. My work is primarily academic. My daily activity, even though I stay active, is primarily sedentary. I'm not the world's toughest guy, and yet through the culture of my family life, through what my kids are taught, through the health that God has allowed my wife and I to give to our children by our lifestyle and disciplines, I raise very strong teenage boys. And there's no secret about it that if my teenage boys wanted to, they could whip my butt. I'm a 48-year-old academic. My kids are teenage athletes. It's very clear that parents, as their sons especially, as their sons get into their upper teenage years, are going to lose the ability to discipline and control their sons. And at that point, that's where the state takes over. And so, for example, in our culture, in America, at 18 years old, children are recognized as legally independent adults. And the reason why that's significant is because the state is saying to all the kids in the society, when you turn 18, not only are you accountable to your parents, but you're accountable to us. And so if you don't listen to your parents and you decide to go and do things your parents tell you not to do, once you cross age 18, the strength of the law is going to come and enforce those rules that your parents taught you and urged you to obey. And so what happens is when older teenagers try to flex their muscles and disobey, they end up running into the law. They get out in their car when they get their driver's license. Their parents say, drive safely, wear your seatbelt, follow the speed limit, don't be reckless. And the children drive away from home. The parents have no means of controlling what they do once they drive down the road. But it doesn't matter because the police are there and the laws of the state now deal with those children. And if that child thinks that, well, he's not going to wear his seatbelt and he's not going to obey the speed limit and he's going to goof around in his car and drive wild on the streets, he'll learn very quickly that there's another level of government in his life that he's accountable to. And the state will step in and stop the children, the adult children, in their disobedience. And so the authority of the parents is reinforced by the authority of the state. And this is what keeps our young adult children safe during their most dangerous years. It's a good thing for children to run into trouble with the law. That's a sign that the state is helping to keep them safe. That's a good thing. There may be some penalties to suffer through in some embarrassing times, but that's a sign that the state is helping us in our mission to protect our children and raise them happily and safely, to keep them from trouble, to keep them from self-destruction. The state assists us with this. And that's how we need to understand that as parents. Embarrassing for sure, but good for everyone involved, especially our children. And the kids, after a year or two of this young adult independence, they start to learn the lesson, and that late teenage wildness begins to calm down and mature. And that's all a good thing. It's rough to get through it, but it's a good thing. And that's how society is supposed to work. If we have a child that just, no matter what the parents do, no matter what the state does, is just insistent upon doing evil, that child, as an adult, ends up in prison, if not dead. That's how the state works, and it always seeks to protect the common good. And we should all be happy with that. Even if one of our children has to be dealt with criminally, it's good for everyone. And we know that we did what we could, and the child simply would not listen, either to us or to the state. That all sounds great. The problem is that in our society, this isn't how life works anymore. It's becoming increasingly clear that the state is not an outer fence that assists the parents and protects the children. And this is owed primarily to democracy, as I said before. What's happening in our society is that as democracy works itself out, the country is coming more and more under the control of the majority, which is, of course, foolish. We would never think that the majority, voting generation after generation after generation, would actually lead us to greater and greater wisdom and virtue. That's the foolishness of democracy. The idea of democracy was established with a spirit of some kind of unreasonable optimism that the human race doesn't deserve. And what we're seeing is the majority of foolish people over time gaining more and more control over how the country operates. And this begins to creep into the home and cause much more destruction than we might think. So, for example, parents, and let's talk about Catholic parents. Catholic parents certainly do not represent the majority. The majority certainly is not promoting the system of values and ideas that are being promoted by good Catholic parents. And so when the kids are young, toddlers, elementary age, and so on, they really don't know much about what's going on outside. They spend most of their time in their Catholic home, with their Catholic parents. Maybe they go out to the grocery store for a little bit. Maybe they go to church with their families. But the younger kids, they don't see much of the world, and their Catholic life at home is just normal. And so we can find all beautiful examples of good Catholic families with young children. Find young parents in their mid to late 20s with some little kids, a 5-year-old, a 2-year-old, a newborn, and everything looks beautiful. And the children really don't think much of their Catholic family life. It's just normal. It's just how things work. However, when the kids start getting older, they start seeing and paying attention to more and more. And they start realizing, especially as they get into puberty years, into their early teens, they start realizing that not many people live the way they do. Not many kids do the things they're made to do. Not many kids have the rules that they have. Not many kids have parents watching over them and staying on top of them like they do. And they begin to look around at these other kids and they start to realize that it's the majority of kids that are not like them. In fact, there's a very, very small number of kids being raised the way they are. And they don't necessarily like it. And so they see all of these examples around them of kids who don't have to pray the way that they're taught to pray, who don't study what they're taught to study, who don't have to follow the rules that they have to follow, who don't have to dress the way they have to dress, and so on. So, a century or two ago, a child might try to complain and object to his parents' rules by arguing that they're not good rules, they're not intelligent rules, that he should be allowed to wear this or do this, or he shouldn't have to do this. And we might even have some good arguments made because at times parents make unreasonable rules. But today things are very different, because today the child can respond with the argument, nobody does this. Nobody dresses like this. Nobody studies these subjects. Nobody listens to this music. Nobody goes to church like this. Nobody does this or that, and so on. And the problem with these arguments is that they're true. They're true. Nobody does these things. And so the parents will respond with some moral lesson like, it doesn't matter what everyone else does. What matters is what God wills. What matters is what the church teaches. What matters is what we say, because this is our home. And you, as a child, need to obey and do what you're told. It doesn't matter what other people are doing. And we have to realize, as parents, we have to realize what a difficult thing this is for our children. It's not supposed to be like this. What these children are saying is not supposed to be true. And we've got to empathize with our kids and realize that they are being asked to do things in a context that we didn't necessarily do them in. I think that the challenges that our kids face are much greater than the challenges that we faced when we were children. I can remember my first grade public school teacher on the first day of school writing the golden rule across the chalkboard and teaching us the golden rule. First day of first grade in public school, we were taught the golden rule. I can remember that my elementary school teachers every single morning leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance, teaching us patriotic songs, teaching us about our government, how important it is to be obedient to the laws, how we should respect our parents and be good citizens, all these things. We were taught these things every day in school, in public school as children. I remember in high school reciting the Pledge of Allegiance every single day at the beginning of the school day. We were taught patriotism. We were taught selfless service. We were taught to understand the concept of the common good. I'd like you to ask around and find out how many kids you can find who go to schools who say the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of the day, who even have an American flag in their classroom. It's a very different society today. So it's a very different culture present today that our kids are growing up in. And we've got to take that into consideration when we deal with them. When we think about the things they say, the things they do, the things they see, the things they hear, and realize how different they are from things that we experience. I know that they're different from things I experienced. So we're going to run into these troubles. Now, add to that all other kinds of modern developments. Add to that computers and the internet. Add to that video games and mobile phones and all these things. The distractions, the difficulties, the challenges, these things continue to multiply. The challenges that our children face today are much greater than they were in past generations. And I know some may say, oh, no, that's not true. It's just sin. No, I don't agree. The temptations that our children face today are much greater, much more prevalent than they were when we were children. I recently read, I forget what I was reading, unfortunately, but I recently read that venial sins, especially sins of humor and joking and things like that, venial sins are used by the demons to make us used to certain topics and actions and sights and sounds to cause us to become more ready to accept mortal sins. And so we can look at things and we can say, well, this movie's not bad. It has a good message. It's not too bad. This song is not too bad. It's got an okay message. We listen to instrumental music. We don't listen to the words. This movie's not too bad. This video game's not so bad. I mean, it's a little silly, but there's nothing bad in it. And we reason like this through a lot of these things because we know that they're not Christian. They're not positively, actively Christian. But we judge them because we say, well, they're not sinful. They're not teaching the kids to be sinful. And we make this justification, and yet it's by little steps that were led to greater sins. And I know that some Christians will say, this is why we cannot allow anything in the house. There can be no internet. There can be not a single video game, no mobile phones, no computers, nothing. We have to block all of this stuff out because we can't allow any of this into our home and so on. And that sounds great. That sounds great. But I'm going to say it's not realistic. It's not realistic because the challenge that it places on our children is just too great. It's too great. It's too much for them to bear. Because they're going to see everyone is doing it. And that is not an exaggeration. They're going to see everyone is doing it. And what's going to happen is the rules of the parents, if they're very, very strict, are going to become too great to bear. And if the child turns to anyone else and talks about these things, the child is going to receive support from these other people. And they're going to be told, your parents are nuts. Your parents' rules are crazy. This is the 21st century. Your parents are going too far, and so on. And the child is just going to be gathering this feedback and input. And the parents, the Catholic parents, are going to become increasingly isolated. Isolated against their children, who actually feel that they have the support of everyone else in their life. And this is going to include grandparents. This is going to include uncles and aunts and cousins. It's going to include their neighbors who live next door and across the street. It's going to appear to our children that everyone lives the same way and does the same things except their parents. And if those parents try to take an extreme, strict position on this stuff, it's just going to backfire. And I believe this is what it's talking about in the Old Testament, in the book of Ecclesiastes, where it says, be not overly righteous. Be not overly righteous. Now, I want to make it clear. I hate this stuff. I didn't invent it. I didn't create this modern culture. I didn't invent the internet. I'm forced to use the internet because it's the way that communication is done. You could say, well, why can't you just print? Look, you're going to just assume the existence of all different kinds of services and programs that are not in your control. You can't live like that. I didn't create these things, but they exist. In God's providence, by God's allowance, they exist. And the challenge that I face as a father is to guide my children in this generation, and I have to do so in a cunning way. I have to be innocent as a lamb, but I've got to be shrewd as a serpent. Now, it's very easy to say, just crack down, just throw it all away, just shut it all off, block it all, completely shut it down. That sounds heroic. And men like to talk this stuff when they have little children. But there's a problem. Like I said, there's a problem realistically with this idea that you're just going to shut it all out. If you look at history, you might wonder, why didn't kings just rule over their people strictly? Why didn't kings just say, here's the law, you either obey my will and do what I say, or you're simply going to get locked up or put to death? Why didn't kings do that? The reason why is because that idea of power isn't realistic. If a person tries to tyrannize another and just usurp total control of that person's life, we're created as creatures with free will. We're always going to resist any attempt to violently act upon us. And violently just means against our will. Anytime someone shows himself to be eager to act against our will and just impose his will upon us, we're going to bite like serpents. We're going to instinctively react against that kind of authority. And this is why that attitude in leadership doesn't work. It's not because the kings weren't strong. It's not because the kings weren't courageous. It's not because the kings weren't diligent in managing their affairs. It's because human nature is free, and it does not respond to attempts to act violently against the will of the individual. After all, that's why we live in a democracy in the first place, because people, once they were able to separate themselves from the reach of their monarchs by traveling across the ocean into a new land, they declared themselves independent of those monarchs. This is all part of the problem. And the harder those monarchs tried to crack down, the more ready the citizens were going to rebel. And so we see in early American history the Boston Tea Party and things like that. We see these acts of rebellion. That's what happens when we simply try to shut the whole thing down. When we try to tighten the screws so much that the children feel that they can't even move. They have no independence. They have no freedom. They have no wiggle room, as it were. It's simply authority and control that's too excessive. And what's going to happen is that child is going to become frustrated and is just going to start to get hotter and hotter and hotter until he finally blows up. And it's going to be provoked by this attempt to be unreasonably strict in this current society, in this generation. And so it takes more prudence than that. Now, the key word here is compromise. Compromise. And I know that for many people who like to talk tough, compromise sounds like weakness. Like, I said that you need to do this, and my wife said no, so I compromised and I let her do what she wants. That's not what compromise is. Compromise means finding a middle ground. And middle doesn't mean middle in terms of exact distance between two positions. It means a balancing position that's good for both parties. And when there's a conflict of will, compromise is important because it's good. Let's say I'm in authority. A compromise is good because it's better than the alternative would be if I just left the other person to his own will. Rather than seeing the compromise as a movement away from my will or my goal or my ideal, if I understand it as a movement in my child's life away from his ideal, which is bad, a compromise is a success. And that's how we need to think about compromise as parents. Our child has a will to do this. It's bad. My desire is to move my child away from that, to not do that, but do something better. Because making the child come all the way to my ideal is not possible. And so I seek a compromise that draws the child closer to my position and further from his foolish intention or from his error. That's what compromise is. It's a way to move a person closer to the desired goal when bringing them all the way to the goal is not possible. And so as parents, we need to learn how to parent through compromise. And this is something that's not to be discussed necessarily with the children, but the parents need to discuss these things. They need to strategize. When they see something developing in their child's life, they need to cut it off before bad things happen. And they need to think about, what do we want the child to do? What is the child willing to do? How can we move the child away from a bad end and find a good compromise from our perspective that allows us to help our child rather than have them run off the rails doing their own will? That's the challenge. That's the wisdom of compromise in parenting. It's not caving in. In fact, it's overcoming the challenge of parenting. If a person just decides to drop the hammer and the child explodes and rebels, let's say the child runs away, the child leaves home, that parent, for this show of strength and toughness, actually just lost the battle. So that's not strength. And I actually believe that many parents like to play the tough parent game because they know the child will rebel and it'll be over. Because they really don't care that the child is kept safe and in a good place, especially through the dangerous years of their teenage years and early adulthood. They're actually selfishly thinking about how nice it would be to not have to deal with this junk anymore. And so this tough guy act, tough dad, my way or the highway, you're telling your daughter to go out into the highway if she chooses not to go your way? That's not strength in leadership. That's just surrender. And yet many men, many parents, even mothers, like to talk with this tough guy talk, not acknowledging that if the child blows up and goes in the opposite direction, you've completely failed. And the end result is the same as it would have been if the child had no parental influence at all. So I think that that's a temptation, to pretend we're so strict and simply surrender and lose the child. Compromise is overcoming that difficulty. I'll give you an example. I have a young adult daughter who met a boy through online discussions and wanted to know if they could meet and go on a date together. Well, of course, my response is no way. Zero. No way. I don't even want to talk about it. But at the same time, once I get done with that irrational ranting inside myself, I think about the situation and I think, what is the worst possible outcome? The worst possible outcome is that my daughter gets into a state of despair and thinks, I'm never going to meet anyone. My dad is too strict. He's never going to approve anybody. And this just boils and boils inside of her until she finally chooses to just do what she wants and splits. Well, I don't want that to happen. That would be the worst possible outcome. Now, the trouble with this, I think, is parents are cheap and lazy. Parents want to raise saints for $0 and with no expense of their own time or energy. And so they're just annoyed by anything that their children require of them. So I had to think with my wife, I don't want to be lazy. This is, my children's souls are the most important things in the world to me. I've got to think, what can I do to make some good out of this? So I told my wife, let's take all the kids to the zoo for the day, and Mary can tell this guy to go to the zoo if he wants to meet her, and she can meet him in person, we can meet him, and we can do so in a public place where everything would be fine. That way I don't have to say, no, you can't, this or that, and make her feel like she's 2 years old. I can say, sure, you can meet this person. Here's an appropriate place. Here's an appropriate context. See what he thinks. The fact that he's willing to meet on those terms is a positive for him. So we did that yesterday, actually. We went to the zoo for the day. Mary, my daughter, had a chance to meet this boy she's talking to. He was willing to meet with us, talk to us, was respectful, nice to us. They spent some time together, getting to know each other. He went home. Happy daughter came home with us. That was a compromise on my part, but I'm happy with the outcome because I know the pressure that these kids face. I know what my daughter sees in the world. I know what she sees outside of our family. And I know that if I were just to put my foot down on my ideal, Because in the world's eyes, I'm crazy. And I did a talk about this once, that we're the crazy ones. On these moral issues and on these religious issues, Christians are the crazy ones. Everyone agrees in opposition to us. We're the isolated, crazy ones. And we've got to realize that. We've got to realize that by the grace of God, we think things and believe things and do things that are unnatural, that are supernatural, that are crazy. And we've got to realize that people who don't have the same grace, people who don't have the same experience, they look at what we do and they don't understand it. It looks crazy. And we've got to be self-aware to realize that. The things that we do are crazy from a human perspective. And I think we've got to be empathetic if we want to have a positive influence on our children. Now, we can't control the decisions of our adult children. We can't control them. It's not our duty to control them. It's not in our power to control them. What we can do, though, is positively influence them. And that's my concern. So that's just a practical example of what I mean by compromise. I think it takes self-sacrifice. It takes, we also paid for this boy to come in and have access to the place for the day. So it cost us something. It cost us time. It took some energy. It took some money. It took some sacrifice of my own will, my own desires, and so on. That's what a compromise is. It led to an end that was much better than the end might have been had I been more strict. And when all the dust settled, everything was good. That's just one example. We can multiply these things 1,000,000 times in 1,000 different directions. And this is the challenge of Catholic parenting today. I can't make my kids Catholics as adults. I can't force them to choose to be faithful, to be loyal to the Catholic Church. I can't force that. No one forced me to do it. I didn't even have Catholic parents. I didn't even have Christian parents. So when I think of the fact that when I was 18, 19 years old, I chose to become a Christian by the grace of God with little to no human influence. I know that it's not dependent on the parents. This has to come from within them, but the challenges that they face today are so great that they have to overcome a much stronger current of human culture than we did, or than I did at least. And I try to be empathetic in dealing with that with my kids. Now, when we make these compromises, which I think are necessary in this generation so that we don't just crash and burn and have our families torn in pieces, when we make these compromises, the key virtue that we need to cultivate is patience. We need to realize that everything we desire is going to take much longer to achieve. We might think that, I'm going to teach this and my child is going to be like this at age 16 or 18 or 21 or so on. But because of the nature of the challenges in this generation, and because we're going to have to make compromises in order to keep our children from flying off the deep end, the good that we desire, the ends that we aim for, are going to take longer. They're going to be more expensive than we anticipated. They're going to take more time than we anticipated. And we have to recalibrate our expectations to align with what's realistic. Let me give you a sports illustration. Many championship teams in sports are at their best when they play the greatest opponents. The more hype that there is about a certain game, the greater the challenge they see in their opponent, the better they'll play as a championship team. They rise to the occasion. When the opposition gets stronger and the game gets tougher, they get better. There are other teams that have a false appearance of being championship teams. And what will happen is, when they play a weaker opponent, they'll lower their standards and they will play down to the opposition. I know I struggled with this when I played sports. I would rise to my best when I played in playoff games or championship games, and then I would end up having a bad game against a team that stunk because I just wasn't motivated to play as much as I was in a big, highly anticipated game. We often played down to our competition. Now, when we consider what our goals are as Catholic parents, we have to realize that our opponent, the opponents that we're playing, are the greatest opponents that could be imaginable. We're fighting against opponents and striving to win a contest that is the greatest imaginable contest of this life. We're striving against an entire society that's set against us. We're striving against spiritual beings that are working against us. We're striving against concupiscence in the hearts of our own children that are working against us. We're trying to do good things for our children that they don't even want to do for themselves. We're fighting against supernatural opponents, and the consequences of this battle that we're fighting is not bragging rights in town. It's not a trophy being gained or lost. It's not money being gained or lost. The consequences of this fight that we're fighting are eternal consequences. They're eternal consequences that affect the most dearly loved and important people in our lives. And if we think about the nature of this contest and realize that it is the greatest possible human contest for us to fight with the greatest possible consequences, we have to engage in that contest in a realistic way. We have to match the opposition. And like I said, we have to realize that today this is a much stronger opponent than he was in recent generations. It's a much stronger opponent with many more advantages over us than he had over parents in past generations. And it's going to be a longer, more exhausting, dirtier, bloodier battle than we likely anticipated when we thought about starting a family. Look at this war in Ukraine. Look at how Russia and Ukraine just are grinding each other. You know, they refer to it as the meat grinder. It's just this slow, destructive, bloody, grinding battle. And there are people who say, this war could just go on forever. This could go on forever. And when we look at NATO and NATO's desire to support Ukraine, NATO has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in supporting Ukraine. NATO has committed to this fight as an important objective, And they've put money on the table. They're offering intelligence support to Ukraine. They're offering training to the Ukrainian soldiers. All of these things, they're investing in this battle. And the Russians never anticipated that the battle would be this great. And so here the Russians are, initially thinking, we're going to fight against Ukraine. We know their capabilities. We know their resources, and so on. Now, all of a sudden, they find themselves fighting against Ukraine, but with the resources and support of all of NATO. And so the Russians have found themselves in a battle that's turned out to be much greater than they anticipated. And so they have to change their tactics. They have to dig in and prepare for a long, drawn-out, bloody, exhausting war. This is what we've got to face. And I don't mean to use Russia as an example to imitate, but the situation there in their war with Ukraine, I think, is similar to the fight that we have against all of this evil we face today. The enemy is much greater than most of us anticipated. And we've got to reorient ourselves. We've got to reconsider our strategies and realize that this is going to be a much more difficult fight than we originally thought it would be. It's going to be more expensive. It's going to be more exhausting. It's going to be much longer. And we've got to prepare ourselves and make adjustments to continue to fight. Because it's not going to be over when our children are 17 or 18. It's going to continue into their early 20s. It's going to continue through their college years. It's going to continue into their late 20s. It's going to continue into their 30s. This battle against all of these evil influences for the souls of our children is not going to be an 18-year fight that ends when they become adults. 50 is the new 30. 30 is the new 18. And we've got to, I argue, we've got to accept that reality and prepare ourselves for a much more complicated battle that's going to last much longer. My oldest son is 23. I feel like he's making progress. I feel like he went into the world overwhelmed by everything in the world. And I know that at that time he saw our family as crazy. He saw me and my wife as crazy. And everyone around him, our relatives, other Catholics, other Christians who are not Catholic, relatives, neighbors, on and on and on, all encouraged him to look at us as crazy people. And I was empathetic towards him because I knew that the challenges he faced were just very great. And I used to tell my wife will testify to this, I used to say, Jonathan might be a bad kid at this point in his life, but he's going to be a good man. And I always used to look at the story of the prodigal son as a model or a pattern for how salvation comes about. And I said, this wasn't a 15-year-old boy embracing the faith and loving his father. This was a boy who went out into the world as a man, indulged all of his lusts and desires, and found himself in the gutter. And then he went home, and his father didn't care one bit about what it costs because his father won that battle. And I also reflect on what Jesus says. I think it's when Mary Magdalene comes to him and she's being judged as a harlot by the Jews, by the Pharisees. And he says, those who are forgiven much love much. Those who are forgiven much are those who sin much, and they come and receive God's mercy after their sins have had their effect. And those are the saints who love the most. And so I'm not afraid of having my kids go through difficulties and challenges and temptations. I'm not afraid of having my kids sin. I'm not afraid of having my kids go off like the prodigal son, because this is all normal in salvation. This is normal. This is what's taught us in the scriptures. This is normal. And so as a parent, I'm committed not to 18 years. I'm committed to the whole entire battle. No matter how long it goes, no matter how much it costs, I'm committed to the end of this war. I'm committed to final victory. Because that's what the scriptures teach. That's what the scriptures show us. They don't show us that the best kids become saints at an early age and live happily ever after in the world. They don't teach us that the best Christians are those who chose to follow God when they were young, who were the most impressive at age 15. That's not what the scriptures or church history teaches us. We find that many of the greatest saints in history were the worst young Catholics. We find that many of them converted later in life and were fueled in their later life by an incredible love for God that came from their gratitude for the mercy that they received, that they did not take for granted. They had went into the world, they had chased after their sins, they had experienced the real fruits of them, and they ran back home to God, and they became the greatest saints. I think about saints like Saint Francis, Saint Augustine, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, and you can obviously name more and more. But these were saints who were converted sinners, who became some of the most influential, wisest, and best Christians to ever live. So I'm not afraid of the difficulty of this battle because I respect the opposition. And I know what I'm seeking. I know that what I'm seeking is the greatest possible human achievement that can be imagined, which is the ultimate salvation and happiness of my children. If we understand, I think, the more I mature as a father and the more I go through this with my children, because I see the bad days and I see the good days, I see the bad decisions they make, and I see the repentance, and I see the hard lessons learned, and I see the good fruits of those hard lessons learned, I realize that this is just a much more difficult mission than I anticipated. I'm not afraid of it. I'm not offended by it. I'm not upset by it. I'm happy for it. Just like I used to love playing in the most competitive games, I love the competition. I love the challenge. I love it. And I just want to understand it so I can prepare for it and engage in it with realistic expectations. Because I'm willing to do that. I have to do that. That's the ultimate mission I have as a parent. There's only so much that I can control. There's only so much that I can do. My children have free will. They're under the influence of 1,000 people other than me. But I want to try to overcome those influences. And I have spiritual weapons in my arsenal. I can offer masses. I can fast. I can pray. I can pray for opportunities to talk where the timing, everything is right about those conversations. And they come. The opportunities come to really dig in and talk about sensitive subjects without fighting and all that kind of stuff. It's a much greater challenge than I ever anticipated. And I think as parents, we've got to avoid giving up, first of all. We've got to avoid just feeling like this is just impossible. It's just, there's no hope. We've got to avoid that. At the same time, we've got to avoid the fake tough guy stuff, the Pharisee parenting, where you just clamp down, tighten everything as tight as you can, knowing it's going to lead to failure, but doing it anyway, spitefully. And then just being happy that you don't have to deal with that kid anymore. That's a parent that's in trouble spiritually. But to understand what I think is the way of Christ, the way of the incarnation, which is compromise, not the compromise of your own standards for your own life, like lowering your standards to get a job and earning a paycheck by doing something immoral. That's a different kind of compromise. I would call that betrayal. I'm talking about compromise where you take a more patient approach to an objective and settle for a short-term gain that you can then use to work towards another short-term gain and bring about the end result more slowly over time, rather than just being rash, my way or the highway, and ending up with your kids on the highway and imagining that you're some kind of tough guy when all you've done is forfeit the battle and hand your children over to your opponent. So that's what I wanted to talk about with parenting. And like I said, the problem is that the state is not doing what the state is supposed to do. In fact, the state is doing the opposite. The state is actually tempting kids away from their parents. The state is actually scoffing at and mocking the religion of parents, which the state is not supposed to do. The state is not punishing people for crimes that are committed, but is allowing them to be committed. And we see this all the time on the news. I saw yesterday in the news there was a protesters blocking a street. I don't know where it was, but there were these obnoxious protesters blocking a street in the middle of a workday. A workman got out of his van to physically push the people out of the street so he could go to work, and the police arrested him. And when we see that, that's not what the state is supposed to do. The state is supposed to keep the streets open. But we see the state actually arresting the workers trying to get to work rather than the people obnoxiously blocking the roads. Another example is this Marine who choked out some obnoxious guy on a subway, and the police turn around and arrest this guy, this Marine. It's this kind of moral craziness that's working against parents. The transgender stuff, the LGBTQ garbage, this stuff is coming from the state and from outside of our families with a force and influence like nothing that's been experienced before. And there's no question that persecution is coming along with it. We're not going to have public executions, but we're going to have arrests and fines and penalties and all kinds of things, blocking of social media channels, shutting down of websites and things like that. It's just a matter of time. But what we've got to think about is the difficulty that our children face in choosing what's good in the presence of this evil society. And we've got to realize that if we try to be nasty to the kids and don't respect the difficulties that they face, we're going to end up making it easier for this ungodly society to win our children's affection. And that's what we have to be careful about. So anyway, that's a lot to think about. a lot of stuff to chew on, a lot of talks that could grow out of this, and I'm happy to get into them, but I hope that's helpful in encouraging you not to be discouraged, encouraging you to really dig in and persevere in this battle that we face, but also to understand that it's better to help your child move 1 inch forward than to try to force them to move all the way in 1 step and ended up causing them to just leave altogether. We've got to be patient and play the long game. And I think that the results will be successful. I've had to go through all kinds of hell with my adult children, but it's just these persevering, incremental successes that continue to encourage me. And even my wife will sit back sometimes and look at me and just say, I feel like everything's going so well, even though absolutely looking at things, we would never have wanted a situation like this. And yet we're seeing as we go through this experience that a lot of things initially appear to be much worse than they really are. And it's our own expectations of ease in parenting, our unrealistic expectations that are the cause of much of our anxiety and vexation. And we've got to learn to think more soberly about these things, because our kids are going to be like 12-year-olds when they're 18. They're going to be like 18-year-olds when they're 30. And we've got to go through this with them and keep helping them and persevere to the end. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know what you think. I'd love to know if you're honest enough to talk about your own experiences as a parent. I'd love to know some of your experiences, if you've experienced the same thing that I have or different things. If you think I'm an idiot and you've got some objective arguments that you'd like to share, please share them, because this is my principal study in life as a father with 10 children, and I want to figure it out. God bless.